Tommy Garrison was 15 when he first heard about the Slenderman. It was a joke back then, a story passed around in his high school locker room like trading cards. "He's tall," his friend Ryan would say, stretching his arms above his head, like basketball player tall, and he wears a suit like he's heading to court. Tommy remembered laughing at the absurdity of it. A faceless man in the woods? Please. But there's a thing about stories. They stick to you. They worm their way into the quiet parts of your mind, and before you know it, you're standing outside in the middle of the night, wondering if that shadow just moved. It was a summer night in Borden, Indiana, a town so small it barely made it onto the map. Tommy and his younger sister Ellie were sitting in their backyard, swatting away mosquitoes and sipping Mountain Dew. Their parents were inside, yelling about the electric bill or something equally boring. Ellie was 9, a scrawny little thing with a mop of blonde hair and a knack for asking questions no one wanted to answer. She was the one who brought it up. "Do you think he's real?" she asked, hugging her knees to her chest. "Who?" Tommy replied, distracted by the glow of his phone screen. "Slenderman." Tommy rolled his eyes. "Ellie, that's just something people made up to scare kids." "But what if he is real?" she pressed, her voice dropping to a whisper. "What if he's watching us right now?" Tommy snorted. "Yeah, sure. Slenderman's just hanging out in Borden, Indiana, waiting to snatch up 2 kids drinking soda. Real scary." Ellie didn't laugh. She just stared out at the woods behind their house, her eyes wide and unblinking. Tommy followed her gaze, and for a moment, just a flicker of a second, he thought he saw something. A tall shape, pale and lean, standing between the trees. But when he blinked, it was gone. That night, Tommy couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that shape in the woods. He told himself it was just his imagination, a trick of the light. Still, he kept his window shut tight and his curtains drawn. The first real sign that something was wrong came 3 days later. Ellie had always been an early riser, the kind of kid who bounced out of bed before the sun was up. But that morning, her bed was empty. Her favorite stuffed bunny, Mr. Flop, lay discarded on the floor. "Ellie?" Tommy called, his voice cracking with the first twinges of panic. He checked the bathroom, the kitchen, even the backyard. Nothing. It wasn't until he saw the back door swinging open that his stomach dropped. He stepped outside, barefoot on the dewy grass, and followed a set of small footprints leading to the edge of the woods. "Ellie!" he shouted, his voice echoing into the trees. Silence. Tommy didn't know how long he wandered, calling her name. The woods seemed to stretch on forever, the trees closing in around him like the bars of a cage. Just as he was about to turn back, he saw it. A figure, impossibly tall and thin, standing dead still in the shadows. It wore a black suit that seemed to blend into the darkness, and its face, or lack thereof, was smooth and pale like polished marble. Tommy froze. His legs felt like they'd been filled with lead. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, but he felt it watching him, pressing down on him like a weight on his chest. "Ellie?" he croaked, his voice barely a whisper. The figure tilted its head, almost curious. Then it pointed, a long, bony finger aimed straight at Tommy. His breath caught in his throat as he turned to look. There, a few feet away, was Ellie. She was sitting cross-legged on the ground, her eyes glassy and unfocused. She was muttering something under her breath, over and over again. Tommy didn't hear the words. He didn't need to. He grabbed her by the arm and ran, the branches tearing at his skin as they tore through the forest. He didn't look back. Ellie didn't talk for 3 days after that. She sat in her room, staring at the wall, clutching Mr. Flop like a lifeline. When she finally spoke, her voice was hoarse, like she'd been screaming for hours. "He wants me to go back," she said. Tommy didn't ask who, he already knew. The nightmares started after that. Tommy would wake up drenched in sweat, his heart pounding like a drum. In his dreams, he was back in the woods, running in circles as the Slenderman loomed behind him, his impossibly long arms stretching out to grab him. Ellie got worse, too. She started talking to things that weren't there, whispering to the shadows in the corners of her room. Their parents thought it was some kind of phase, but Tommy knew better. He could feel it now, that presence, always just out of sight. It wasn't until the night Ellie disappeared again that Tommy realized the truth. He woke up to the sound of the back door creaking open. His heart dropped as he bolted out of bed, stumbling down the stairs. The door was ajar, a cold breeze blowing through the house. "Ellie!" he shouted, panic clawing at his throat. He ran into the woods, his flashlight flickering as he tore through the underbrush. It didn't take long to find her. She was standing in a clearing, her back to him. And he wasn't alone. The Slenderman was there, towering over her like a shadow come to life. His arms hung unnaturally long at his sides, his faceless head tilted downward as if studying her. "Ellie!" Tommy screamed. She didn't turn around. She just stood there, her head tilted back, her hands hanging limply at her sides. Tommy didn't think. He charged forward, grabbing her by the shoulders and yanking her away. For a moment he thought it worked, but then he felt it. A cold, slimy hand wrapping around his wrist. He turned and saw nothing. No face, no eyes, just emptiness. Tommy woke up in his bed the next morning. His head was pounding and his wrist throbbed where the hand had grabbed him. Ellie was gone. The police searched for weeks, but they didn't find a trace. The town moved on, but Tommy couldn't. He dropped out of school, moved away, tried to forget. The dreams never stopped. He still saw that pale, faceless figure standing in the woods, pointing at him, calling him back. And sometimes, late at night, he swears he can hear Ellie's voice, faint and far away, whispering, "He's still watching." Sarah Collins was never a believer in things that go bump in the night. She had grown up in the small town of Pine Hollow, a place where everyone knew everyone else's business, and where the biggest drama was a neighbor's overdue lawn care. The stories, the legends, they were always just that, stories. But things change, people change. And the woods don't forget. It was mid-October when the first of the strange things began to happen. Sarah was walking home from her part-time job at the local diner. The sun was setting, the air crisp, and the leaves turning golden along the winding road. Pine Hollow had always been picturesque, the kind of town you'd see on a postcard, but as Sarah neared the edge of the woods that bordered her home, she felt a chill settle over her. She wasn't alone. It wasn't anything she could explain, but the hairs on the back of her neck stood up as she walked past the familiar trees. The rustling of the wind through the pine needles sounded off. It was too deliberate, too measured. A whisper of movement, not the usual flutter of the wind. She paused, heart racing for no reason at all, and turned to look behind her. The woods were quiet now, nothing but a sea of twisted trunks and dark shadows stretching out before her. Nothing out of the ordinary. She even chuckled to herself, shaking off the unease. But then, as she started walking again, something caught her eye. A figure. It was far in the distance, standing still between the trees. At first she thought it was one of the men from the logging crew, or maybe a hiker passing through. But as her eyes adjusted to the dimming light, she realized there was something wrong. The figure was impossibly tall, taller than any man she had ever seen. Its shape was a blur, like a shadow that had taken form but was unable to make sense of itself. It was dressed in a suit, but the fabric appeared too dark, too deep a black to be natural, and the face, or the lack of one, that was the part that froze her blood. It was smooth, featureless, a blank canvas that made her stomach lurch. Sarah turned her head quickly, afraid that even looking at it would make it move closer. She tried to laugh it off, to convince herself it was just a trick of the fading light, but her instincts screamed at her to run. She didn't. Instead, she kept walking, faster now, her pulse thumping in her ears. By the time she reached her front porch, she dared to glance back. The figure was gone, but it wasn't the last time she would see it. The next few days were a blur of unease. Sarah tried to push the strange encounter from her mind, but the feeling lingered. Every time she walked home from work, she felt like she was being watched. The hairs on her neck would stand up, and her eyes would dart into the trees, expecting to see that tall, faceless figure again. But it was always gone, always just out of sight. That was, until one rainy evening a week later. Sarah had just gotten off her shift at the diner. She was exhausted, drenched from the downpour that had suddenly descended on the town, and desperate to get home. She could barely see the road in front of her, the mist from the rain blending with the thick fog that had rolled in from the woods. It was then that she heard the first whisper. She froze. The sound wasn't like the usual rustle of the rain on the ground. It was a low, muffled voice, almost too soft. It seemed to be coming from the trees. Her heart raced as the whisper grew louder, distinct now but still unintelligible. She could feel something in the air, an unnatural pull, like the trees themselves were drawing her in. A cold breath, as if from the very earth, swept across her face. Sarah stepped back, her fingers trembling as she clutched her jacket tighter. There was no one around, no lights, no cars, just the forest closing in on her. The whispering grew, and now she could almost make out a single word. Sarah? It wasn't her name spoken in the way a person would say it. It was empty, hollow, like something that had been buried for a long time, something that had no right to be in her world. Her mind screamed at her to turn around, to run, but her feet wouldn't move. Her body was frozen. Then she heard it, a sharp crack, like something snapping in half. The sound echoed through the trees, followed by another and another, as if branches were being torn apart. And then, as Sarah's breath caught in her throat, she saw it. The figure, slender like a man, but too tall. His limbs stretched out unnaturally long, fingers like hooks reaching toward the ground. His black suit shimmered in the mist, and that faceless mask, smooth and unblinking, was fixed directly on her. The world around her went silent, save for the pounding of her heart. Sarah. The whisper came again, but this time it was close, too close, like a breath on her ear. She stumbled back, knocking into the wet pavement. Her legs buckled beneath her as the figure took a step toward her. Each movement was impossibly slow, but it was no less terrifying. As it reached out its elongated hand, Sarah screamed, pushing herself away. Her scream echoed into the night, but there was no one to hear it. Sarah never returned to Pine Hollow after that night. The town was never the same, and neither was she. The figure from the woods, Slenderman, whatever it was, had followed her, leaving her hunted by that hollow presence for years. It whispered to her in her sleep, its faceless form lurking just beyond the edge of her vision. She moved across the country, trying to escape the whispers, trying to forget the tall, faceless man who had followed her from the woods. But he never left. Not really. Every new town, every new house, he was there, watching. Sometimes she could hear him in the pines, calling her name. And sometimes, just sometimes, she swears she can still see him standing just beyond the trees, taller than any man in the shadows, waiting for her to come back. It was late September, just as the leaves were beginning to turn in the little town of Cargill, Ohio. Sarah Miller had just moved in, a city girl seeking escape from the concrete jungle of Cleveland. Her parents had bought a charming little house on the edge of town, where the woods seemed to whisper secrets to anyone who would listen. Sarah was too busy unpacking boxes to pay any mind to the legends the locals whispered about those woods. She had better things to do, like figuring out where to put the bookshelves in her room. The first night in the house, everything felt fine. The creak of the old wooden floors, the scent of fresh paint, and the hum of the refrigerator filled the empty spaces. But by the second night, Sarah began to notice something strange. It started with the lights. It flickered on and off, just enough to be unsettling, not enough to be completely terrifying. Sarah thought it was the wiring. It was an old house, after all. The second night, she thought maybe it was just the wind knocking something loose in the attic. But the third night, when the lights flickered again, there was a presence in the room. It wasn't just a technical malfunction. It felt like something, was watching her. She shrugged it off, convinced it was the odd sensations of settling into a new place. But then came the sounds. She woke up that night to the sound of something scraping against the walls. At first it seemed like an animal, maybe a raccoon or a bird pecking at the window, but the sound grew sharper, deliberate, almost rhythmic. Sarah lay in bed, her heart racing, her breath caught in her throat. It was too late to be the wind. She reached over and turned on the lamp, but the room was empty. No birds, no animals, just the walls, silent in the aftermath of the noise. But when she looked out the window, everything froze. In the distance, beyond the glow of the streetlight, a figure stood at the edge of the trees, tall, too tall, the kind of tall that made your head spin if you stared at it for too long. Its limbs stretched unnaturally, the arms impossibly long. The figure was dark against the backdrop of the trees, its body like a shadow, but not quite. She couldn't make out any details. It was just wrong. The shape of it made her chest tighten. The face, or lack of one, was what got her. No eyes, no mouth. Just smooth like a mannequin's face, empty and cold. She turned away quickly, her pulse pounding in her ears, but the figure stayed there, unmoving, watching. The next day, Sarah didn't leave the house. She told herself she was being paranoid, that she had just seen something strange in the night, something her brain couldn't quite make sense of. But as the days wore on, the feeling of being watched never left. She began to see glimpses of the figure again, always in the distance, always on the edge of her vision. Each time it was closer than before, as if it was slowly making its way toward her, step by deliberate step. The townspeople didn't help. When she mentioned it to a few of them, she was met with vague answers and nervous glances. "That's just the way it is around here, hun," one old woman told her. "The woods have a way of making people lose their minds." The following Saturday, Sarah decided to take a walk. She needed to clear her head, get away from the oppressive air in the house. It was a beautiful fall day, the kind of weather that made you want to be outside, breathing in the fresh air. She walked along the road that led into the woods, the sunlight filtering through the trees above her. The deeper she went, the quieter it became. At first, it was peaceful, the kind of silence that envelops you when you're far from civilization. But as she ventured further into the woods, she felt it again, the sensation that she wasn't alone. The wind stilled. The birds stopped singing. The only sound left was her own footsteps crunching on the dry leaves beneath her. It wasn't right. It was too quiet. Then, she saw it. At the edge of the trees, near a bend in the path, the figure stood again. Its long, spindly limbs seemed to stretch impossibly high into the canopy, bending at angles that shouldn't have been possible. Its face was still the same, smooth, featureless, empty, but this time it was closer, a lot closer. It was standing just on the edge of the path now, only a few feet away. Her heart stopped. It didn't move, it didn't speak, but Sarah could feel its gaze. It was as if it was reaching into her very soul, trying to pull something out from deep within her. And then it did something even worse. Its arm, longer than humanly possible, began to stretch toward her, its fingers curling like branches, reaching with a slow, deliberate movement. The ground beneath Sarah's feet seemed to shake. The air grew thick and suffocating, the kind of pressure that made it hard to breathe. With a rush of adrenaline, she turned and ran. She ran faster than she ever had in her life, her feet pounding against the forest floor, branches slapping her face, but she didn't stop. She didn't dare look behind her. She just kept running, the sound of her own breathing drowned out by the thumping of her heart in her chest. By the time she reached the edge of the woods, she was gasping for breath, her legs trembling. She didn't look back. She didn't dare. That night, Sarah locked every door and window in the house. She sat by the window, staring into the dark, watching for any sign of movement. Her phone was beside her, her thumb hovering over the number to the police. But she didn't call. She knew they wouldn't believe her. No one would. The next morning, Sarah was gone. Her car was still parked in the driveway, her bags were missing, and there was no sign of a struggle. It was as though she had vanished into thin air, just like that. The townspeople searched the woods, but they found nothing. There were no clues, no signs of what had happened to her. The only thing left was an eerie silence, like the woods themselves were hiding the truth. Some say she ran away, but the ones who know better, those who have seen the figure in the trees, they know the truth. They know that some things in the woods don't let go. And the Slenderman? Well, he always gets his way in the end. The thing about the woods near Hartwell, a small town in the middle of nowhere, is that people forget about them. It's easy to forget, you see. You drive past it every day without ever thinking twice about the tall, black trees that line the road. But if you were to stop, take a breath, and look long enough, you might begin to notice something strange about the way the trees lean into the road, like they're waiting for you, like they're watching. It was late October when Jason Holt first decided to venture into the woods. He was bored, he admitted to himself, but he was also looking for something. It was the kind of feeling that creeps up on you, the kind of itch you can't scratch. His friends had been talking about the woods for months, joking around about the spooky stuff people said happened out there, people who disappeared or lost time in the trees. "I bet you wouldn't last 10 minutes out there," Mike had said one night while they were drinking in Jason's garage. "I heard people go in and never come back, or they come back and don't remember a damn thing." Jason had laughed it off, like any 17-year-old would. But by the end of the week, that itch was unbearable. He wasn't scared. He wasn't stupid either. He just wanted to see what all the fuss was about. He grabbed his jacket and slipped out the door before his parents could stop him. It was already getting dark by the time he hit the trail. The woods looked different in the evening, quieter, more oppressive, like they were holding their breath. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves. He walked, the crunch of his boots on the trail the only sound, until he reached the clearing. It wasn't much of a clearing, just a few yards of open space before the trees thickened again. That's when he saw it. The tree in the center of the clearing was wrong. He couldn't explain it, not at first. It was a massive, blackened thing, like it had been burned from the inside out. The bark was split, jagged like scars. And what made it even worse were the things hanging from its branches. Jason stepped closer, squinting to get a better look. They were torn pieces of clothing, jackets, shoes, tattered shirts, fluttering in the breeze, but the way they moved wasn't natural. They didn't sway like they should have. They twitched, jerking, as if something was still moving beneath them, something alive. That's when he heard it, a low humming noise that seemed to come from deep in the woods. It was faint at first, barely perceptible, but it grew louder, like a distant growl. Jason froze. It wasn't the sound of wind through the trees, it wasn't an animal. It was something else, something human, something wrong. His heart started to pound. His instincts screamed at him to turn around and run. But instead, he took another step toward the tree. His feet were moving of their own accord now, like he had no control over them. He couldn't stop. He didn't want to stop. And that's when he saw it. A figure, tall, impossibly tall, looming in the shadows of the trees. Its body was thin, unnaturally long, its arms stretching out like spider legs. But it wasn't the height that made Jason's skin crawl. No, it was the face. Or rather, the lack of one. A smooth, featureless surface where a face should have been, like a mask that was too tight for its own good. Jason's breath hitched in his throat. His legs froze. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. He wanted to run, but his feet wouldn't move. The thing stepped forward, slowly, deliberately. Its limbs stretched unnaturally as it moved closer to him. The humming noise grew louder, like the thing was breathing, or worse, feeding. The air turned icy cold, and Jason could feel the weight of it pressing against him like the woods themselves were trying to suffocate him. Then, out of nowhere, the sound of a voice, low, gravelly, spoke from behind him. Don't look at it. Whatever you do, don't look at it. Jason spun around, heart racing, but there was no one there. The voice had come from nowhere, but it had been so clear, so real. He didn't know who had spoken or how they knew he was here, but that one sentence, don't look at it, pounded in his head like a warning. He looked back at the figure. It was closer now, too close. It reached out, its fingers long and spindly, impossibly long, and for the briefest moment Jason saw it. Saw the hollow void that was its face, that black pit where its eyes should have been. He could feel it staring into him, into his very soul. And that's when he realized something awful. The thing wasn't just looking at him, it was looking through him. It was seeing something inside him, something deep down that he couldn't even explain. It knows me. Jason snapped out of it. His feet moved before his brain could catch up. He turned and ran. The woods were a blur of branches and shadows as he sprinted, heart pounding in his chest, the sound of his breath loud in his ears. He ran until his legs burned, until the weight of whatever was chasing him seemed to lift. And when he finally made it back to the road, he didn't stop. He didn't slow down. He ran all the way back home, burst through the door, and locked it behind him. The next morning, he didn't tell anyone. He didn't even go to school. He couldn't. The memory of what he had seen, the thing in the woods, was burned into his mind. He couldn't shake it, and he didn't want to. He couldn't tell anyone what had happened, because who would believe him? That night, he locked the doors and closed the windows, but as he lay in bed, he heard it again. The humming, low, distant, but getting closer. And the worst part? He could swear, for just a second, he saw a shadow cross his bedroom window. The hollow was never just a story. It was a place, a thing, something alive in the woods, waiting for anyone foolish enough to wander in. Jason Holt never went back to those woods, and he never spoke of what happened to him. But the woods, they remembered. The thing about it was, no one ever saw it coming, not until it was already too late. It started with a rumor, like most things do in small towns. That's how it always is, right? People don't really believe in something until they hear it from someone they trust. That's when the real fear starts to creep in, slithering like a snake in the grass. And in Smithfield, the rumor came from Jake Tyler, a quiet kid, the kind of guy who stayed out of trouble. Jake didn't make stuff up. At least, no one thought he did. But when he started talking about the woods, people started paying attention. "Something's out there," he'd said one night, his voice barely a whisper, eyes darting around the room. We were all sitting in the old diner, the place that hadn't changed since the 70s, the smell of fried food and old leather still heavy in the air. I saw it. Tall guy. Really tall. No face, just a suit. He was watching me. The guys laughed at first, because that's what you do in a town like ours when a guy says something that doesn't make sense. But Jake kept talking. "I don't think I was alone in the woods that night," he said, his hands shaking. "He was waiting for me." That was Jake, though. He had always been different, more reserved, more prone to fits of paranoia. But after that night, something shifted in the air. It was like the very land beneath us was holding its breath. A couple of days passed, and then other kids started talking. I didn't believe it at first. I really didn't. I mean, who would? The Slenderman was just a legend, right? Something that kids made up to scare themselves. I remember thinking, it's just a story. It's just a story, nothing more. But as the days went by, the stories became darker. They didn't sound like pranks anymore. They didn't sound like kids trying to get attention. They sounded real. I think that was the worst part. The feeling that someone was hiding in the corners of the world, just waiting for you to believe it was true. That's when I decided to go out there. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't want anyone to think I was scared. So, one evening, just before sunset, I grabbed a flashlight and headed for the woods. The woods weren't much to look at in the daylight, just thick, gnarled trees with their branches scraping against each other like old bones. But as the sun started to dip below the horizon, they became something else. They became alive. They seemed to grow darker, thicker, as if they were swallowing the light itself. I was deep in the woods, moving through the underbrush when I felt it, a shiver that ran up my spine. Not the kind of chill you get from being outside in the cold, but something else. It was like I was being watched. You know that feeling? When you look over your shoulder and you don't even know why, but you just know someone's behind you? I felt that. My pulse quickened. I pushed the thought aside, telling myself it was just the wind or maybe a deer. But the longer I stayed out there, the more I couldn't shake the feeling. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the trees. It was something else. And then I saw it. At first I thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow moving in the distance. But then I saw it again, clearer this time. A tall figure standing motionless between two trees, so still that it almost looked like part of the forest itself. Its arms were unnaturally long, hanging by its sides, and it wore a black suit that shimmered in the fading light. And the face. God, the face. There was nothing. Just a smooth, featureless surface where a face should be. It was like staring into a void, a black pit that you couldn't escape from. My heart stopped, and I froze. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. It was looking at me. No, not just looking, watching. I don't know how I knew it, but I could feel its eyes on me, even though it didn't have eyes. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and all of a sudden I felt like I wasn't supposed to be there. Like I was trespassing on something ancient, something that didn't belong to us. I stumbled backward, my legs shaking, but I couldn't take my eyes off it. I don't know why. Maybe it was because I thought if I looked away, it would move closer. Maybe I thought if I kept watching I could understand it, but all I knew was this: it wasn't supposed to be there. And neither was I. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone, vanished into the trees like it was never there to begin with. I stood there, my heart pounding in my chest, unsure of what to do next. Should I run? Should I stay? But I didn't run. I couldn't. Something told me if I ran, it would follow me. So I did the only thing I could think of. I turned and walked back the way I came, slowly at first, then faster, until I was running. I didn't stop until I was back in my truck, breathless and shaking. I thought I was safe. I thought it was over. But the next day, something happened that made me realize I wasn't. There were pictures. The pictures were all over town, on telephone poles, on the sides of buildings, photos of Jake Tyler, only they weren't the pictures of Jake that anyone remembered. They were different. In each one, Jake's face was wrong, blurred, distorted, as if something was crawling underneath his skin, something that wasn't supposed to be there. And the worst part? In every single photo, in the background, standing just behind him, was the tall figure in the black suit. I don't know how long it's been since that day. Time feels strange now. I've moved away from Smithfield. I had to. I couldn't stay. I couldn't even look at the woods again. But I still see it sometimes, in the corner of my eye. That same figure, that same smooth face staring at me, no matter where I am. And I know deep down that it's not done with me.